超孫命を覚えているな。超もう孫でお前が殺した男の名だ。まさかお前は。来い、最後は武術家らしく死なせてやる。
こんにちは。私たちは D&DGaming です。よろしくお願いします。Hi guys, my name is Dale and welcome to D&DGaming Retro Review. In for review this time is action-adventure game Shenmue. Reviewing the game with me is my brother Dav.
Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Shenmue is an action-adventure role-playing game developed and published by Sega and directed and produced by legendary game developer Ryo Hazuki. Game released in 1999 for the then newly released Sega Dreamcast console. The game is set in Yokosuka, Japan in 1986, and you play as teenager Ryo Hazuki, who sets out seeking revenge for the murder of his father. Along the way, you unravel mysteries surrounding the Hazuki name as you get closer to understanding why Iwao Hazuki was murdered. Just to note, we're reviewing the PC port of the game released in 2018, not the original Dreamcast version. Sadly, my original Dreamcast and original version of the game are long gone. We would usually do our first impressions at this point, but as both of us have played the game before, I thought it best to change it to be called replay impressions. So Dale, what are your replay impressions of the game?
Yeah, as we both have quite a lot of history with the game, the playthrough was more of a refresh. And like you say, we can't really give it first impressions as such. Although I hadn't played it for many years, and certainly not since the 2018 PC port. So I'd also forgotten quite a lot of it over the years, to be honest. It's fair to say Dav has played it a lot more than me, and sometimes back in the day I'd just watch his playthrough on the Dreamcast and maybe sometimes jump in to play certain sections. The story immediately came back to me though, and some sections I remembered very clearly, but there was also a lot that I didn't remember or had just missed previously. So this was the first full playthrough on my own, and it was really nostalgic and still very impressed with how it stands up today in 2022.
So I've played this game multiple times since release 23 years ago, and the first thing that always hits me is the graphics. I still can't believe they look as good as they do all these years later. Shame I haven't fared the same, really. The other thing that hits me with this game is nostalgia. The game blew me away in lots of ways when I first played it on Dreamcast in '99, and that always comes sweeping back over me every time I pick up the game. Just to mention also that even though both of us have played the game multiple times and I'm a big fan of the Shenmue franchise, we will be honest where things aren't so great in the game and won't just concentrate on the good things. We provide honest game reviews on this channel, so no game gets preferable treatment. So in terms of general thoughts following playthrough,
I was immediately impressed by how good the game looked. I had of course prepared myself for a game from 1999, so I was fully expecting quite a poor experience, to be honest, from a graphical standpoint, but luckily this wasn't the case. It is a game with a lot of cutscenes, and even early on you realise the pace of the game is a lot slower than many others. Until the game had a huge budget and almost feels like a movie at times, it really is hard to compare to anything that was around at the time. I remember it really did make a big impact on me at the time with the scale of the game. Compared to other more modern games, it's definitely not as open world and is quite linear in places, but at the time it was mind-blowing how much freedom there was and all the different areas that you could go through. They really all felt alive. There was nothing like this at the time. Although the game isn't often listed as an RPG for some reason, it certainly feels like an RPG and has many elements associated with that genre. I noticed a lot of times it is simply labelled as an action-adventure game, but to me it definitely felt like an RPG. The environmental detail was considered unprecedented at the time, with numerous interactive objects, day and night system, variable weather effects, NPCs who had their own daily schedules, and numerous mini games, which most of them are great as well. I particularly enjoyed the darts mini game when needing to kill time. I really did enjoy the playthrough for the most part, and although there are some frustrations that I'll come onto later, it really does deserve the recognition and acclaim that it's built up over the years.
I'm a big fan of the Shenmue franchise, and this game, in my opinion, was the game that paved the way for modern RPGs and the open world game movement, really. It ushered in a much more modern graphic style, unique features not seen in games of the time, and quite diverse gameplay. After what was probably my 5th playthrough, my interest in this game and the Shenmue franchise is still as strong as ever, and I agree with the things that Dale said already. So in terms of graphic options, how did you find those?
I did find the very limited options graphically, but this was a time way before the deep customization you have in modern games, as the hardware was so limited back then. I'm really not going to mark it down for this, and I thought it looks great on the default settings.
As you point out, very few graphic options to choose from. Kind of expected from a game that's over 20 years old. The ported version that we're playing does have additional graphic options that were not in the original, but they're still very basic. So in terms of graphics performance, how did you find that?
Yeah, the graphics look great even now, and the 2018 port seems to have been optimized well. As I mentioned, I had to get in the mindset of the kind of 1999 graphics quality, but once I started playing, I was actually really impressed with how it looks. I mean, I have no issue with dated graphics, and played numerous games with horrendous graphics because they're so old, but it doesn't cause an issue for me as long as the game is good and the story is good, and it certainly has all of that in this case. So yeah, I really enjoyed the graphics on this one actually. 2018 port included new graphics options, but I believe it is locked at 1080p, so it was downscaled somewhat for me as I'm playing on a 1440p monitor, and the cutscenes are still presented in their original aspect ratio, I believe due to technical limitations. But yeah, overall really impressed with the graphics.
So we'll put our PC specs up on screen as always, but I thought the graphics were really good, and yeah, the same really stood up really well for a 23-year-old game. So in terms of graphics for this game, it's always been hailed as being up there when it comes to graphics, and I agree with the general consensus on this. However, I have still heard so many times over the years, few people who obviously have some kind of hate for Shenmue or feel the need to troll the game or whatever, saying that the graphics are nothing special or they just look shit. The only fair way to discuss and compare the graphics of Shenmue is to look at games that were developed at the same time. So to do so, I put together a list of 9 of the best highly commended games which released the same year as Shenmue in 1999. Therefore, they would have been developed using similar gaming engines, similar graphic technology capabilities, and similar limitations in graphics of the time as well. By the way, I'm not hating on any of these games. They're all great games in their own right, but it's an interesting comparison from a graphics perspective, and these also are said in no particular order. Medal of Honor, System Shock 2, Driver, Unreal Tournament, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, Final Fantasy VIII, Silent Hill, and Gran Turismo. I personally don't think any of these games even come close on a graphics and animation standpoint to Shenmue. Shenmue has far better texture quality with less jagged edges, more depth of field, longer draw distances, more advanced lighting, smoother animations than any of those games by quite some way. And this footage showing now is the Dreamcast version of graphics. There are quite a few notable improvements in the recent port that we've been playing, as you can see side by side, mainly the interface, but generally they stayed true to the original. As Dale pointed out earlier, they have upscaled from the original to 1080p. I'm glad they did this, as messing with the graphics and trying to update them substantially for the port could have screwed up a classic. Instead, they simply added a few graphics options to the menu that wouldn't have been available on the original Dreamcast, and tweak some of the UI and game menus to update them. So what I would say to finish this point on graphics is that it really depends on where you're coming from. If you're comparing it to games these days, then of course it doesn't compete. How would a 23-year-old game do that? And it's not a fair comparison. But if you're coming from a fairer point of comparing games of the same era, then who can really say that any of those games or any other games released that year come close to Shenmue? Again, to reiterate, I'm not hating on any of those games. It's purely from a graphics and animations perspective here that I'm focused on and comparing, really.
So in terms of player controls, I played using keyboard and mouse, although that was mostly keyboard, as the mouse has very little function and is mostly just used in the menus. It's not the most intuitive layout, and it was very clunky which I kind of expected given that it was originally a console game and clearly designed for playing on a controller. Over the years, I've been kind of dead set on using the keyboard for some reason, and I've even played a whole range of different driving games on keyboard and mouse. So I'm quite used to the challenges involved, where a game is not designed for it. But again, because I'm so used to using the mouse and keyboard, I think I could be quite critical of the controls on this one, despite it being originally designed for consoles and being used on a controller. There were some illogical key bindings that they used on this port in terms of the default settings, and I think I'd recommend using a controller if you do have one. Main issues for me were the QTEs, or the quick time events. I found basically I had to cross my hands over to use WASD and the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 at the same time, because the QT events, which no doubt will have numerous ones up on the screen throughout the review, but they tend to use on the keyboard WASD for up, down, left, right, and then the 1, 2, 3, 4 for an alternative trigger. But it's just really awkward when you're trying to use those at the same time. Not sure why they chose this as the default layout. I could have rebound them, but I guess I kind of got used to it in the end. The number pad is used for the free fighting, so I didn't want to rebind it to anything on the number pad for the QTE events. But the number pad itself for the free fighting was mostly fine actually, and combined with buttons such as WASD and Shift, it was not too hard to master the various combos. So the awkward controls for me were mostly just sometimes maneuvering Ryo around, trying to line him up with a door, for example, and the QTE events were the main issues for me.
Yeah, so predominantly it's a third-person game. However, you can go into first-person view when using the controls, when searching for items, etc. As Dale's pointed out, with keyboard, there is full rebindings available if you want to rebind them, but as you pointed out, there are some illogical key bindings, so you may want to rebind them if you're playing on keyboard. I actually played this using an Xbox controller connected to my PC. In my previous playthroughs on PC, I found the controls very clunky with the keyboard, as Dale's pointed out, and so playing with a controller really took me back to playing on Dreamcast, and it was less clunky and easier to use. Having said that, the controls, even using a controller, are generally quite clunky. The player movement isn't that smooth, the walk and run movement, and always feels like it's kind of on or off. There's no smooth between mode, which modern games have today. However, alongside the age of the game and how the games have come on in controls since the game was released, one other thing to bear in mind with this game is that one of the game's main focuses is martial arts and fighting. The development of the Shenmue game came out of the development of the Virtual Fighter series, which Yu Suzuki had previously worked on, and so the controls have a very arcade feel to them. It's like they took the side-on 2D movement of Virtual Fighter and adapted it for 3D. So when moving around outside of the martial arts and fighting parts, it does feel quite clunky and likely for that reason. I did find when using a controller that the game seemed to get a bit confused at points whether I was going to use the keyboard or controller. This meant that sometimes coming into an area, for example, before pressing anything on the controller, the button graphic in the bottom right of the screen would show up as keyboard. And then as I pressed the button on controller, it would automatically switch to show the controller buttons. This generally wasn't a problem, but I did notice it do it on a few QTE parts. I was in a bar fight, as I always do, and a keyboard button popped up that I had to press instead of the controller button. I quickly pressed one of the controller buttons, as I wouldn't have been able to press the keyboard button in time anyway, but I didn't get the equivalent controller button, as there was no way of telling which controller button it would have been. So I ended up getting a bottle in the face, and then the game realised I was using the controller from me pressing the button, and for the next pop-up it showed us the controller. This happened a few times, which got a bit annoying. I guess a way around it would probably be to unplug the keyboard when using the controller to sort of unconfuse the gamer, so to speak. But luckily it didn't get so bad that I felt the need to do so, really. But it's worth mentioning, if you're using a controller, it may be worth unplugging your keyboard whilst you're playing the game. So in terms of story and gameplay, the year is 1986, and in early December, Ryo Hazuki returns home to Yokosuka, Japan, to find his father mid-battle with a stranger. The man kills Iwao Hazuki in front of Ryo, who also gets hurt in the incident, and the man disappears having stolen an ancient item. Following a brief recovery, Ryo then seeks revenge for his father's death and begins searching for clues as to who this stranger was, what he was after, and why his father was killed.
So in terms of gameplay mechanics, the main focus of Shenmue is story-driven and revolves around gaining information from NPCs in the game and searching locations. You speak to local people, asking questions to piece together the trail of the man you're chasing down. Some of the NPCs help you and others don't. Some are rushing around and practically ignore you and tell you to go away. Others don't know what you're talking about and can't help. So the game does involve a lot of walking around and asking pretty much the same questions to multiple people. As you gain useful information, this is recorded as notes in a diary. The game has quite a slow pace to it, which may frustrate some gamers, especially if you're perhaps more used to the pace of modern, faster games. There are additional things you can do alongside the main story quests. These include martial arts training, which can be performed in a few different locations, playing games in the arcade, and buying collectible items. Martial arts training improves Ryo's attacks during fights and also helps to learn new moves. The games available to play in the arcade include 2 different types of darts games, regular darts
Yatta!
and neo darts,
Yatta!
QTE and QTE2, quick time games that test your fighting reactions. A game called Hang On, a motorcycle arcade racing game created by Ryo Hazuki, and Space Harrier, an arcade shooting game also created by Ryo Hazuki. There's also a casino where you can bet on slot machines. The main collectibles in the game are gacha, or toy capsules, essentially collected from the capsule machines in numerous locations in the game. There are various categories of collectibles, from Sega classic characters like Sonic and Virtual Fighter characters, to vehicles, controller button icons, and animals. Another collectible item is the cassette tapes that can be bought from the in-game shops and played on a cassette player, provided you find the cassette player to begin with, that is. The game has story-driven cutscenes that come in sometimes randomly and unexpected. Some of the cutscenes lead on to QTE situations and others are simply information story-based. The QTE does play a big part in the game. For those who don't know, QTE stands for Quick Time Events. For these events, basically the game goes to a cutscene and then buttons will flash on the screen which you have to press in time before they disappear. QTE events are usually fights or chases, and by missing a button, you usually take a hit if it's a fight, or screw up part of the chase if that's the event. The length of the events vary, and if you fail them, the game automatically starts the event again. Fighting and martial arts is a big part of the game. There are 3 different types of fights. QTE fights already mentioned, one-on-one fights, and multi-person battles. QTE fights are the cutscene based, whereas the one-on-one and multi-person battles are arcade style fighting based on the Virtual Fighter series. The game has a dynamic weather system with weather information taken from the actual time and location of the setting of the game in Japan. The first of its kind in any game of the era, and far ahead of any other games of the same era. It's these kind of things that you can see why the budget was so high and why they exceeded the budget. Is just the sheer amount of detail that went into the game. People in the game all have their own routines that they play out each day, such as going to and from work, which does make the game feel more realistic. And for the time, when it came out in 1999, again, this was completely unique, really. The NPCs, they don't just randomly walk around in circles on a map like most games did with NPCs in this era of gaming, and sometimes still do in modern games.
So in terms of UI, the UI is relatively simple. You have a watch icon in the top right, which also has a compass on it for time and direction awareness. In the bottom right is a selection of buttons. If you're playing on a keyboard, these show as keyboard buttons. And if you're playing with a controller, they show as controller buttons, obviously. These are used to enter numerous menus and interact with the environment. When in fight mode, the buttons switch to show icons for punch, kick, throw, and dodge.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. The port in 2018 did include improved UI. We'll put it up on the screen now so you can see the differences. I believe this mostly just kind of led to a cleaner, more modern looking UI in the 2018 port.
So in terms of sound and music, the music in the game is very varied. It does repeat in certain locations, such as the arcade, but there's always some kind of music going on in all locations and situations. The music also really suits the game in terms of style, and it's very of the time, based in 1980s Japan.
いくらですか？
船便あったこれよ
これだ。一番早い便を。
The voice acting, however, is not so great, and there's always been a contentious point with the Shenmue games. You do get a choice to play the game with American sounding character accents or in Japanese with English subtitles, but either way the voice acting is cringy and not particularly good. I've played with both and would suggest the Japanese voices with subtitles are best, really. Not only are the American sounding voices the worst sounding of the two, you also get a much more authentic game experience playing with Japanese speaking NPCs. The only downside is having to read the subtitles, I guess.
どうした？ちょっと聞きたいことが。ほう。喧嘩には負けねえって目だな。さあ、ガキは向こう行きな。
The game's environment sounds generally not too bad, but not great either at times. Sometimes they are quite echoey. I don't know how they recorded those, but there's points where it seems to be a lot of feedback. I do like as you walk around, the sounds of the busy streets, people talking, things going on are always there, and it makes the game feel very alive.
おじさん。よう、りょうちゃんか。
I played with the original Japanese voice actors and English subtitles on, as I'd remembered how bad the overdub was back in the day. I understand they updated both the Japanese and English voices in the 2018 port, and so the English might be better than before, but I didn't try that. I just used the original Japanese voicing. So use the English dub at your own risk. I did read a funny anecdote actually that one of the developers said that at the time when they were very short on the scheduling for doing the English voice acting, and they basically, anyone in Japan at the time who claimed to be an English voice actor of any sort was basically roped in, so they had enough people, and the scripting was done by numerous translators, and it was all done on a very tight timeline, so that might go some way in explaining why the English dub was so bad. Voice acting generally is okay. It does sound quite monotonous at times, I found, and some of the voice acting, for example, the Navy guys, is just bad at times, and I did come across this guy as well.
Merry Christmas!
The music was great in sections, and there's a whole range of songs included in the soundtrack. Again, you can tell the budget was big here, as it was just like a movie soundtrack, basically.
In terms of bugs and glitches, I had a couple of brief frame freezes, but nothing major. And I guess the random keyboard controller confusion by the game was mentioned earlier, but this wasn't in any way game breaking.
Fortunately, I didn't have any bugs or any glitches really at all, actually, that I noticed. So, yeah, no issues for me at all, which was nice.
It does feel like it was quite a good port that they put across to PC.
Yeah, it was actually. It seemed to be well optimized.
To sum up, things I liked about the game, I've always loved the story in the Shenmue franchise. When this game came out, games were far more basic. Shenmue felt like you were playing the plot of a character in a movie, and that was completely unique at the time. As mentioned earlier, the graphics and the animation for the time was second to none and years ahead of their time. Personally, I think it was only with the release of GTA 3 in 2001 that the Shenmue graphics were actually rivaled. And by this time, Sega had released Shenmue 2, and that again blew everything out of the water in terms of graphics and animation. Again, Sega were a step ahead on this. Attention to detail. I love the fact that you can search around for items, open every drawer, etc. Sometimes you find things you can use, other times you find nothing. This is something that I've heard people complain about before, which I find a bit strange. Personally, I don't think a game would be realistic if every cupboard and every drawer you looked in had something to use or take. It's an RPG. You know, it's not a first-person shooter. It's not like you're just going to find ammo in every single drawer. So I think it's a bit strange that people complain about this. The mix of fighting types, QTE, one-on-one, multi-person, I really like those. It stops the fighting element of the game getting too repetitive. Also, the fighting is based on genuine martial arts styles, not just randomly put together.
So in terms of things I liked about the game, it's such an atmospheric game, lots of NPCs going about their business, and the world really feels alive, as we touched on earlier. You know, every NPC has their own schedule, the shops open and close at particular times. And the way you literally can check the time on your watch at any point, it really is, you know, outstanding in terms of creating an immersive world. Day and night cycle, the weather changes, they're all very innovative for the time. Really was a step ahead. I found it can be very relaxing to play, or at least when you're not fighting, that is. Yeah, I really felt just relaxing into it at times, getting lost in the game with the music, and yeah, it was just such a good game to get lost in. There is a lot of back and forth at points between the house and other areas at times, but luckily, I don't know if this was in the original actually, but certainly in this port, there's the fast travel option when you leave the house, so you don't always have to travel through every area to get where you need to go, and I found that very useful. I thought it was a great soundtrack and great music, great atmospheric sounds, even if the voice acting wasn't amazing. I like that it sets the story well for the continuation of the series, and you really kind of want to jump into the next one just to see where it's going.
So in terms of things I didn't like, the game is very slow at times, and it does get quite grindy and can be quite mundane, especially when you get to work at the docks and you have to go back and forth each day. In one way, I like this part of the game and that mundane day-to-day feature, as it gives the game its realism and role-playing feel. The fact that Ryo needs to travel and can't afford to means that he has to earn money. Skipping that in the game would be like taking a vital point away from its role-playing aspect. But in other ways it does get a bit much at times, and I can understand how some people don't like that part of the game. The voice acting is quite bad. It doesn't ruin the game, but it is cringy at points, as we mentioned earlier.
Merry Christmas!
For me, the clunky controls were quite an issue. It would have been good if they could have at least improved this for this 2018 port. You know, they had the opportunity to improve those, and it would have been nice to see that. I don't like the fact that some of the key defaults are really odd, like mentioned earlier, the QTE defaults. Again, you know, linking into what I just said, it could have been improved for the port. The general pace of the game and the fact that sometimes it feels like you're just filling time. The pacing was a little slow at times for me. It would be, for example, come back at XX time tomorrow, and you know, you can't progress the story until that time, so you just have to go off and fill the time. You know, at first it's quite fun playing the arcade games or collecting all the gacha toys, but it does reach a point where you do feel like you're just killing time. Sometimes it can be relaxing, other times you just want to get on with the next part. I did find the QTE requires a bit too fast reactions at times, especially on such awkward default keys on the keyboard. I mean, you really do have to be bloody quick to get it right the first time, and I found it's one of these games that, you know, quite often it would take you a second try to actually get it correct, just because you need a rough idea of what keys are going to come up. I noticed there's a lot of popping in and out randomly of the NPCs. This was no doubt due to the graphical limitations of the time, but again, for this port, it would have been nice to have seen that improved. I found that, sometimes the NPC might literally be in front of you and then just disappears, or multiple NPCs all disappear around you. I did find the end game had a kind of too many long cutscenes, and without going into spoilers, but the fighting got a little tedious towards the end for me. So, Dav, do you think there were any missed opportunities in this?
I think that the questioning of the NPCs could have thrown up options to choose from on what to ask, or ways of asking, rather than automatically saying lines that are programmed. This could have then improved the dialogue slightly, rather than asking each and every NPC pretty much the exact same thing as you're trying to find out information as you go around.
For me, I mentioned in my positives actually about how the fast travel option from the house was a nice touch. But it would have been nice to have had the fast travel option work the other way around as well. For example, going from the docks area, where you're doing quite a lot of the game times, it would have been nice to go directly from there back to the house without having to either get the bus wankers, or wait till 11:30 when you automatically get transported home. Yeah, it's almost like that fast travel system was only one way. So it's from the house to, this location, but you can never do it the other way around.
So in terms of scores, Dale, what do you think?
Yeah, so this is one of those games that is often included on lists of the greatest games of all time, and with good reason. At the time, it's groundbreaking and innovative, and still stands up well today, which is impressive given the absolute huge leaps forward in technology since 1999. There are, however, some issues with the pacing of the game and the other frustrations that I mentioned. So for me, it's going to be a still very high, given quite critical scoring, but a very high 8.5 out of 10.
So for me, it's a classic game that's only the very beginning of the overall story for Shenmue. It's not going to be to everyone's taste. If you're just into modern fast-paced games, then you're likely not to like this sort of slower-paced game. But if you want a retro game that has a movie-like story, authentic Japanese gaming experience, and great graphics and animations for its age, then look no further than Shenmue, really. So personally, very few downfalls with the game, and our opinion is that no game can be a 10 out of 10 with our scoring. So I have to give this a full D&DGaming score of 9 out of 10.
Well, guys, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe and comment. Hit that bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video, and we'll see you in the next one.
メリークリスマス。あ、お兄さん、スナック